Yes, as through this world I've wandered, I've seen lots of funny men. Some will rob you with a six gun, and some with a fountain pen. Woody Guthrie, Pretty Boy Floyd. For the comrades, we fight on. Part 1. There's no crime in Avalon. How do I know so much about prisons? No, I wasn't ever locked up. I mean, jail, sure. If you manage to live as long as I do, without pissing off some small-town deputy dog so much that he sticks you in the pokey overnight, you're not living. But I was never incarcerated in a state or federal facility. But, yes, I know a lot about prisons. It's a long story. I mean long. Hey, look, it's a beautiful night. We could just listen to the owls hunt the furry critters, or we could push our sleeping pads together. It's a warm night. Okay, I'll tell the story. But remember, you asked to hear it. Yes, it's a fraud story. They're all fraud stories. But at least this one doesn't have anything to do with cryptocurrency. This one's from decades before that business. This is from the Mesozoic era, the second great era of high-tech scams. Yes, I mean the dot-com bubble. Yeah, I know you were there too. But you were working for a big, serious company. You didn't see the churn and the froth. I bet you've never even heard of cab candy. Yeah, cab candy. Like, taxi and junk food. It's exactly what it sounds like. They raised $7 million. 1. Avalon is a chocolate box town on an enchanted island 22 miles from the port of Los Angeles. Catalina Island, the redoubt of the Wrigley chewing gum fortune, acquired by William Wrigley Jr. in 1919 and developed as the chic spot for Hollywood's smart set. For years, starlets, leading men, producers, and directors plied the channel on wooden ships out of Long Beach, drinking cocktails on the 3-hour crossing, vomiting discreetly over the railings. They caroused at Old Man Wrigley's Casino, the largest building on the island, a 12-story Art Deco roundhouse with a ground-floor cinema and its own pipe organ. And above it, the largest ballroom in the USA, known to a glamour-hungry nation as the source of a weekly broadcast live from high atop the casino on beautiful Catalina Island. The one thing the casino didn't have? Gambling. Wrigley fancied himself a sophisticate, and his casino took its name from the Italian word for gathering place. The fact that this confused everyone who visited for the rest of time only reinforced Wrigley's superiority. There was no gambling at the Catalina Casino because gambling leads to crime, and there's no crime in Avalon. That's what the tourist brochures tell you. It's what the 4,000 year-round locals tell you. It's what the 2,000-odd beautiful people who own summer homes on the island tell you. If you're one of the members of the 35,000-strong July 4th weekend crowd, you'll come home and tell it to your friends. There's no crime in Avalon. Scott Worms brought me to Avalon in 2006, 1 year after he sold Interpoly to Yahoo and became a millionaire at 23. Scott had been forced into the sale by his investors, and I'd helped him a little, untangling their creative accounting so he didn't get crammed at the sale time and lose the equity he'd bargained hard for at 21 when he founded the company. Scott didn't want to work at Yahoo, and truth be told, Yahoo didn't want Scott working there, but Scott's Yahoo shares wouldn't fully vest for 3 more years. He was already a millionaire, but if he hung in or got fired, he'd be a decimillionaire. Corollary, if he quit, he'd lose tens of millions of dollars. At 23 years of age, 3 years felt like an eternity to Scott, but he had plans for those remaining millions. 20 mil if Yahoo's share price held, maybe more if it went up. So Scott and Yahoo were playing chicken. He wanted them to fire him, but not for cause. And so he became an expert on California employment law. Scott could become an expert on any subject in 6 months. California employment law only took him 2. He made sure that he engaged in precisely as much fuckery as the law allowed and not 1 nanogram more, which is how he ended up on Avalon. Scott was formally a vice president, as was typical for the CEOs of the dozens of companies Yahoo bought, with billions pumped into it by SoftBank's Masayoshi Son. That meant that he was entitled to 5 weeks of paid vacation every year, which no Yahoo exec came close to taking, not even the French ones. Scott took every single day he was entitled to. 25 days of paid leave translated into 12.5 4-day weekends per year. Add in federal and state holidays and sick days, and that number went up to 24 4-day weekends per year. Then there were the conferences, offsites, and team building retreats, at least one of those every month, and then the time off in lieu of the travel days and overnights. And Scott was taking 32 short weeks per year, plus 2 weeks at Christmas. He was entitled to a plush office, which he generously allowed other teams to book as a meeting room or getaway space because it was so often empty. Scott liked microbrewed beer, and his grateful coworkers often brought by a bottle of something they'd taken home from a brew pub or made in their garage, and they'd put it in his grocery store-style glass door refrigerator with a post-it of thanks and tasting notes. Scott was part of an executive committee that was supposed to evaluate possible acquisition targets, companies like Interpoly. The only times Scott came close to quitting Yahoo and forfeiting his 20 mil were when a really promising startup came through the door. The combination of a smart founder and a great product made Scott pine for all the time he was wasting. Even worse was his dreadful knowledge that if he gave an honest assessment of the startup he'd just heard pitched, he'd trap some other naif like him in the Yahoo quicksand. He had a good nose for this stuff, and he'd use the preliminary documents to schedule his long weekends, making sure he was in town and present only for meetings where they were hearing from stupid companies making stupid products. He found it physically painful to sit through their pitches without tongue-flaying their founders, but at least he could honestly sit down with the rest of the committee afterward and recommend that the companies stay the hell away from the wretched startups they'd heard from that day. Generally, the committee would all agree with him. The sole exception was Cab Candy, a startup that wanted to fill taxi drivers' trunks with candy and use a web-based dispatch to turn major metros cab drivers into circulating snack delivery service for hungry stoners. Scott correctly pointed out that this was a profoundly stupid idea. The other committee members pointed out that Cab Candy had much better fundamentals than its rivals, the successors to Cosmo.com. Scott replied that Cosmo had collapsed and the post-Cosmo stonersnack.coms would do no better. The committee overrode his objections and offered a term sheet to Cab Candy, $7 million on $12 million pre-money, but they were outbid by Battery Ventures, who offered 9 on 14. After Cab Candy, Scott decided to use one of his sick days and go to Avalon, and he invited me down for the long weekend. Fly into Long Beach, Marty, and we'll chop her over. He was deliberately breezy, clearly wanting to impress me. I'd been in helicopters. They're noisy. But Scott was as eager as a puppy, and he just wanted me to have a good time. It's a date, I said. Let me check Expedia for flights from Oakland. Southwest is your best bet. They're not on Expedia, and they've got a website that doesn't suck. It didn't suck, which was quite an accomplishment for an airline, to be frank. I caught the 5:15 and we touched down in Long Beach at 6:07, 4 minutes ahead of schedule. Scott met me at the baggage carousel, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Marty fucking Hench! He grabbed me in a big hug. He was still 98 pounds, soaking wet, tall, and bony. He'd gotten rid of his ponytail and gotten a millionaire's haircut, something that transformed his cheekbones and prominent teeth from skull-like to aquiline. And he'd replaced his crooked wire-rim glasses with a pair of aviators with clear lenses, which was a statement, though I couldn't tell you what it was trying to say. He released me from the hug. Scott fucking warms, I replied. You're looking good. Sky blue Hugo Boss blazer with turned-up cuffs, striped shiny lining, and orange satin accents at the slash pockets. Obligatory Japanese denim as stiff as cardboard. Some kind of designer sandals that looked like something Salvador Dali would put on Jesus's feet. I'm so glad you came, buddy. Catalina is crazy. Like nowhere I've been before. They've got bison. Oh, here are the bags. There'd only been 8 people on my flight and only 4 bags spilled onto the belt. I grabbed for mine, but Scott got it before me and shot the handle. Come on! He took off for the private airfield. I followed him out the door and into the cool, sea-scented Long Beach night, across a couple of crosswalks, and then up to a gate where a private security guard checked his ID and mine against a list on his screen. I was just a 40-something forensic accountant back then, with a good line in unwinding high-tech scams, and I was far from a rich man. But I'd flown private a few times. Sometimes clients claim they can only fit in a meeting on their biz jet, but I didn't see the attraction. Not then, when it just convinced me that I was working for someone with more dollars than sense. And not much later in life when a big score set me up with enough money to fly private anytime I want. I keep waiting for the day when private flyers are subjected to even 1% of the indignities of a TSA checkpoint, but every time I fly, it's the same. I could have brought a wheelie bag full of C4 and packing nails through that checkpoint, and they wouldn't have known about it. I sure hoped no one mentioned this to Osama bin Laden. The helicopter was waiting for us, Scott's bag already aboard. We climbed in using the little running board, and the pilot, a gray hair with the bearing of an ex-military pilot gone to fat, welcomed us aboard and showed us to our headphones, giant earmuffs with curly cable umbilici that plugged into armrest 1/8-inch jacks, reminding me of my old high school hi-fi set. Once we snapped into our 5-point harnesses and opened our complimentary mineral waters, Scott toggled some switches on an overhead panel, and we were on a channel with the pilot. We're all ready, Captain, he said. Roger that, the pilot said in perfect Air Force monotone. Going private now, Captain, Scott said. The pilot gave us a thumbs up and kicked in the engines, and my whole skeleton began to buzz with the chopper's roar. We lifted off, and Scott let out a whoop and drummed his thighs. Oh, buddy, I can't tell you how bad I needed this, he said, and it's so good to see you. It's good to see you too, Scott. How's life in the punctuation factory? That's what we called Yahoo in tribute to that asinine exclamation point. Don't ask. Let's talk about this weekend instead. Normally, I stay at a friend's place. There's about a half dozen people I know with summer places there, and they've all got guest rooms. But I thought it might be awkward for you to crash with a stranger, so I booked us rooms at the Zane Grey Hotel. As in the author? Zane Grey pretty much invented the cowboy novel. My old man had dozens of his books and would always circle the TV Guide listings for the movie adaptations. There were more than 100 of them, and he loved every one, but insisted that none of them came close to the books. Yeah, it's his old house. He built a summer place there, old Pueblo style, and just kept adding onto it every time he got a fat check. It's a hotel now. Gorgeous. I got us the penthouse. 4 balconies, a patio, harbor views. Maybe I made a face. My business did just fine. The dot-com bubble had sucked in billions for every harebrained scheme you could imagine, and some of that money disappeared into creative spreadsheets. Hardly a month went by without my being called upon to find a couple of million that had been made to disappear through a black hole in one of those spreadsheet cells. My take was 25% of whatever I recovered, and I recovered a lot. But even so, I didn't have punctuation factory money. This Zane Grey place sounded pricey. "It's on me," he said. "My invitation, my tab, I insist. I wanted to stay at this place since I first laid eyes on it. Man, I can't wait." We were high over the channel now, the deepest channel off any coast, anywhere. It's a crime scene. There's no crime in Avalon, but just offshore, that channel is the final resting place of tens of thousands of barrels of DDT dumped there by Montrose Chemical in steel that was thoroughly, utterly incapable of maintaining its integrity at the bottom of a 3,000-foot saltwater channel. Down in those depths, there's crimes whose perps belong in front of the International Court of Justice for Crimes Against Humanity. The sun was just setting right in our eyes, the Pacific blue sky turning the color of fresh blood, then dried blood, and then that flash of green just as the sun dipped over the horizon. "There it is!" Scott pointed and bounced a little in his seat. From the air, Catalina Island was a rugged Mediterranean hillscape with a picture postcard seaside village nestled in its little harbor, where ranked yachts bobbed and a ferry backed and filled to turn around. The towering casino anchored the town to the right, a cream-colored squat cylinder topped with a dark rice paddy hat of a roof, whose red brick color flared in the last rays of the sun. To the left, the harbor turned into a beach road that girded a cliff. We banked that way, and there was the helipad, lit up with spotlights. The pilot angled us in, leveled off, and sank down, both skids kissing the ground at the same moment. A couple of ground crew in high vis ran out to tie us down, and then the pilot unbuckled, stepped into the passenger area, and opened the door, stretching out his arm in an "after you" gesture. We stepped out into the Catalina night. 2. Old Man Wrigley launched his chewing gum fortune in 1891. Company lore says he was a door-to-door soap salesman who had the bright idea of putting a free piece of gum in with his soap, and the gum was so popular he got out of the soap biz and jumped into gum. Wrigley might have been good at gum, but he was better at business. Specifically, he was extremely good at convincing investors to back him as he acquired 95% of the world's chicle tree forests. All the gum in the world was Wrigley gum. Either Wrigley made it or someone else made it and paid Wrigley for the privilege. In 1890, a year before the Wrigley Company was founded, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Bill, named after its primary author, Senator John Sherman, a William Tecumseh's baby brother and a man almost as grimly determined once he set his mind to something. In his impassioned speech to the Senate, Sherman said, "If we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of the necessaries of life. If we would not submit to an emperor, we should not submit to an autocrat of trade with power to prevent competition and to fix the price of any commodity." The Sherman Act was law when Wrigley set out to corner the market on chicle, but it was a weak and struggling thing. Sherman's main target was a robber baron who cornered the market on something far more precious than chicle, John D. Rockefeller, who owned the oil, the railroads, the banks, and the state lawmakers who oversaw them. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company fell to antitrust law in 1911, 21 years after the Sherman Act's passage and 11 years after they put Sherman himself into the ground. That buying 95% of the world's chicle violated the Sherman Act is beyond doubt. But is it truly a crime if no one prosecutes you? What if you spend your fortune in harmless and charming ways, say by buying the Chicago Cubs, they call it Wrigley Field for a reason, and then bringing them to your celebrity weekend or island for spring training every year? Clearly, this is not a crime because there is no crime on Catalina Island. The Zane Grey sent out a driver in a liveried golf cart to take us in. The island had strict limits on cars, and the waiting list was more than a decade long, but the golf cart policy was more generous. The driver was a kid named Antonio, who told us he was a local whose great-grandpa moved there before Wrigley bought the island, graduated Avalon High, the local K-12, and married his high school sweetheart. Antonio told us all this as he drove us away from the rotor wash that blew our hair and found its way up the cuffs of our pants. Once we were on the long, quiet curve of the sea road, Scott leaned forward. "You an In-N-Out fan, Antonio?" Antonio looked around at us so quickly that the golf cart actually swerved a little, and he had to look forward again to get it back in the middle of the lane. Sorry, he called. In-N-Out? Scott said, "I bought a sack of burgers in Long Beach before we took off. They might even still be warm. Fries, too." "Really?" Antonio said. "Damn! Sir, could I possibly buy one of those from you?" Scott smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "They're for you, Antonio. 6 double-doubles, 6 orders of fries. No milkshakes, I'm afraid. I couldn't figure out how to pack them so they'd keep cold." Antonio slowed the golf cart, pulled onto the shoulder by a chest-high railing. "Seriously, sir? That's very generous of you. It's not my first time on the island. I usually stay with friends out in Hamilton Cove. I know enough locals that I know what to bring." Antonio's smile was wide enough to lift his scalp and send his chauffeur's hat askew. "Thank you, sir. Thanks very much." He got the golf cart back in gear, and we sped down the road, past the ferry docks, through a tiny roundabout and onto a beachside tourist strip of souvenir shops and breakfast places and busy bars open to the night. Then swung onto the town streets, lined with pretty little vacation homes and locals' places. At a Ralph's Grocery, we turned left to parallel the beach road for a few blocks, then descended to the beach again, fronted now by a seawall. Another cute roundabout got us onto a steeply pitched driveway walled in with whitewashed rustic plaster. The golf cart struggled up the hill and creaked into the hotel's entrance court, where another employee, in matching livery, hopped to and helped us out of the cart and unloaded our bags. Scott interrupted him, got his bag back, and unzipped it, producing a grease-spotted In-N-Out sack, which he solemnly presented to a wide-eyed and grinning Antonio. Antonio took the sack and pumped Scott's arm in energetic thanks, while the bellman took custody of Scott's bag again, looking jealously at the sack. No need to stop at the check-in desk. We were expected. The bellman and one of his colleagues humped our bags up the stairs to the penthouse while we followed. They showed us around the 3 bedrooms, the 4 patios, the kitchen, the dining/living room, switched on lights, and accepted a 20 each from Scott. I got the distinct impression that either of them would have preferred a burger. Once we were seated on the patio with beers from the ice bucket that had been waiting for us on the kitchen counter, Scott clinked with me, and we both drank and watched the little shore boats run people around the moored yachts in the twinkling harbor below us. "About those burgers," I said. He laughed quietly. "No fast food chains on the island. Local council's orders. It preserves the character of the place." I happen to think they're right, but a weird side effect is that the locals fetishize In-N-Out and McDonald's. Forbidden fruit. Did you see how that guy's face lit up? Absolutely worth having everything in my suitcase stink of hamburger for the weekend. There's no In-N-Out in Avalon. We stayed up chatting and watching the moon paint a milky river on the ocean and slept in the next morning. Scott woke me to let me know that room service had just arrived with breakfast, and I joined him on the patio for muesli, sourdough toast, unpasteurized honey, cold German breakfast sausage, and fresh squeezed orange juice, and a press pot of Kona coffee. We ate it while the high sun baked the patio tiles and made our flesh sting. And then we put up the big shade umbrella. You brought a sun hat, right? I had, my Uncle Ed's old Air Force mechanic's hat. You'll need it, he said. Lots of open space on the bison tour. Antonio was our tour guide. He had a permit from the Island Trust, which the Wrigley family had created and then donated 98% of Catalina Island to. That let him drive us, this time in a four-wheel drive Jeep, not a golf cart, up to high ground, past the country club and the zip lines, and through the gates into the wildlife reserve. The bison were brought over in the 1920s for a Zane Grey movie shoot, he said, as we climbed a winding country road. The director wanted big suckers, so he brought males. Now, your male bison doesn't much like other males, won't stay in their company for long, so they busted out and took off. Old man Wrigley liked how they looked, so he brought over 13 females so they could have Christian relations. He smiled to let us know he also thought this was foolishness. But bisons are more pagan than Christian. They get together in harems, a bunch of lady bison and just one big old bull. He downshifted the Jeep as the road got steeper. Now, this was once the stagecoach road, he said. Visitors headed for Two Harbors would take a horse-drawn coach across the island, about a day's journey. Can you imagine how those horses had to work on this hill? You see those trees there? He gestured at the evenly spaced, mature, straight trees running along the outside edge of the road. Either of you gentlemen recognize them? Scott smiled. I've had this tour, so I'm not going to answer. What about you, Marty? I've been a Californian ever since I dropped out of MIT, got my accounting certificate, and lit out for the West Coast, where all the computer companies were. I have a pretty good grasp of California plant life, though mostly focused on the Northern California varieties. These ones had strange, streaky bark, like they'd been partially peeled. Unmistakable. Still, I could tell Antonio was busting to show off, so I said, "Sorry, I can't place them." "That's because they're Australian," he said, looking over his shoulder to grin at me, then looking back in time to keep the car from crashing into one of those trees. "Eucalyptuses. They were Ada Wrigley's idea. We call them the guardrail trees. You see, they're spaced close enough that a car can't squeeze between them. A few cars have crashed into them, but they never went over the edge." He downshifted and cranked the wheel around a hairpin, then put his foot down again. The engine revved. Ada liked them because they're also called gum trees, and she was a Wrigley. Beautiful, aren't they? They were. Australia has a lot of beautiful plants and animals, and most of them are, frankly, monsters. The eucalypt is no exception. Its reproductive strategy is to drop those heavy, oily leaves around its base until the trapped heat and the highly flammable oil consummate their tragic love affair and burst into flame. The ensuing forest fires reduce the eucalypts to ashes, but the same goes for all the plants that might compete with them. The difference is that eucalypt seed pods need fire to open up and release their seeds, and the fires that coax them open also eliminate all the canopy cover that might compete with them for sunlight, while the ashes of the fallen competing trees enrich the soil with nutrients. That life cycle played out in Australia for millennia, but has been playing out in Southern California since the 1850s, when nitwit settlers imported them and planted them in an act of slow-motion arson that gives PG&E a run for its money in the competition to see who can burn down the state first. We saw our first bison half an hour later, after driving past a few hikers with tents on their backs, heading to an inland campsite. It was a cow, a big one. She was standing on a distant hill, placidly contemplating the dry gulch that separated her from the dusty road Antonio had been traversing. We came to a stop and watched her. Scott rolled down his window and got out his SLR and a long lens and snapped some pictures. "The Tongva people lived here for 8,000 years, Antonio said in his tour guide voice. They called the island Pimu. They traded with people from all over the Americas, and anthropologists have found artifacts made with materials from thousands of miles away." In 1924, the amateur archaeologist, that is, grave robber, Ralph Glidden, opened his Indian Museum in Avalon Harbor. It was a museum built of bones, filled with the desecrated remains of Tongva people and their grave goods. It remained in operation until 1950. The looted remains, including 30,000 teeth, sat in storage until they were given a Tongva burial in 2017. The conquistadors enslaved the Tongva, used them to build the missions that every California school kid studies in the 4th grade. Their children were kidnapped to those missions and forcibly stripped of their language, culture, and faith. Later, the Americans enslaved them again, this time through indenture, after the act of being an Indian in California became a crime in a dozen petty ways. Tongva, convicted of crimes, were sold to white settlers under the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. The Tongva were never put on a reservation. They learned Spanish and styled themselves as Mexicans. And in 1921, the Los Angeles Times declared they were extinct. Meanwhile, their children were still kidnapped by federal agents and sent to the Sherman Indian High School in Riverside, where they were tormented beyond all reason. The Tongva of Pimu had a front row seat for all of that. They were forced off the island in 1930 by the Spaniards, who renamed the island after St. Catherine of Alexandria, whose 4th century martyrdom took place 1,600 years after the Tongva settled Pimu. There are fewer than 4,000 Tongva left on this earth today. None of them live on Catalina Island. There is no crime on Catalina Island. Three. We spent the afternoon dozing in a cabana at the Descanso Beach Club, drinking scotch and soda highballs and watching the pretty young people frolic. Then we strolled back to the penthouse and picked at the high tea the Zane Grey had laid out for us on the dining room table. I took a nap while Scott plugged in his laptop and paid 25 cents per minute to dial up to his ISP's local number and answer his email. Then I rose, slugged back the last of the coffee in the pot Scott had brewed, took a shower, and got dressed for dinner. We were going to a party. Antonio was waiting with the golf cart when we wafted down the stairs, preceded by some fancy cologne Scott bought in an airport duty-free and insisted that I try. It was nice. A little too citrusy, a sort of musky lemon pledge, but nice. Antonio drove us back out past the casino, lit by floodlights that showed off the Art Deco murals of the naked mermaid over the doorway, to a slip where a shore boat was tied up. He locked the golf cart up and stepped aboard, then held the rope tight while we did the same. They don't like it when we approach by boat, but it's a pretty night. Life vests under your seat, gentlemen, he said. Don't worry, you won't need them. I'll go slow. He did, puttering out around the curve of the casino. There's heavy artillery down here, he said, from World War II, back when this place was full of soldiers in case the Japanese tried to take it over. When the war was over, they just pushed it into the harbor. The Army, huh? Scott smiled, his face lit up by the big white moon. Not just the Army. Spooks. This is where they created the OSS, who became the CIA. There's no crime on Catalina Island. The party was in Hamilton Cove, a private condominium development out past the Descanso Beach Club, all stepped white walls and orange tile roofs. Very exclusive. I don't come out this way much, Antonio said. They don't really mix with locals, and not many of our guests have friends here. They're nice places, Scott said absently, scanning the ziggurat of condos set into the cliff face for his friend's place. Ah, he said, pointing. Looks like they're in full swing. Good. I hate being the first ones at a party. Lionel Coleman Jr. grew up in the hotel business. Lionel Sr. owned 2 of the nicest hotels on the Sunset Strip, a famous little exclusive boutique hotel in Malibu, and a big conference hotel in Palm Springs. Junior didn't like running hotels. He liked finance. He convinced Senior to let him throw a lot of money around at the end of the Clinton administration to help pass the 1999 REIT Modernization Act, and then he took the family business into high gear. Real estate investment trusts were created in 1960 as a way for mom-and-pop investors to shelter the retirement income from a duplex or a granny flat. The 1999 Act transformed this modest, working-class tax shelter into a vehicle for high finance. Junior realized that if he sold his family hotels to an REIT, the rent he paid to them would be tax-free. But of course, he'd still have to pay tax on the income the hotels brought in. But Junior had an angle for that, too. This newfangled financial crime called a taxable REIT subsidiary. This was a separate company owned by Junior's REIT, which provided all the day-to-day management of Junior's family hotels. So let's sum up. Each hotel had 3 corporations that kept it running. First, there was the family business, which owned the hotel's IP. That's the company's husk, its brand, its trademarks, its phone numbers and URLs, and goodwill in the form of positive reviews in a half-century's worth of travel guides. Then there was the REIT, which owned the actual hotel building and collected rent from the family business. Rent that was tax-free because a REIT was born to be a way for Grandma and Grampy to live out their dotage with dignity, collecting rent from a little duplex or a granny flat over the garage. Finally, there was the TRS, the taxable REIT subsidiary. This company negotiated with the family business on behalf of the REIT, collecting a management fee in exchange for actually payrolling the desk clerks and chambermaids, paying the laundry services invoices, keeping the pools clean, and the kitchen's fridges stocked with food. The 3 businesses were a shell game. Find the P being the taxable income. The taxable income moves from one company to the next. You rent a room, the hotel remits enough of the room charge to the TRS so that it breaks even, owing no tax. Or if Junior had some money from somewhere else he wanted to hide, the TRS could make a loss and get a tax credit to offset those other profits. Remember, the consulting fees the TRS charged were based on fictional hours of consulting time that Junior's accountants generated each quarter by working backward. Take the number of dollars that Junior wanted the TRS to absorb, divide by the hourly consulting fee, charge accordingly. The remaining money, the actual profits, flowed through the REIT and were tax-free. Junior plowed these into more hotels and then a couple of strip malls. Then he discovered middle-income apartment buildings, 20 to 50 units, and he bought up a dozen or more of those, mostly in the halfway affluent suburbs of Detroit and Cleveland, the last pockets of money remaining in the collapsing Rust Belt. Junior, Lionel, as he asked me to call him when he greeted us at the door and clapped Scott in a big back-thumping hug and treated me to the equivalent handshake, hard squeeze, and a flurry of pneumatic pumps, explained all of this to me as I drank his rum out of a bulbous pina colada glass, over ice and coconut milk. It was good rum, good enough that I'd have happily drunk it neat. It was from a French distiller, a company that finished dark Caribbean rums by aging them in cognac casks as a means of mobilizing idle capital. Le Bureau National Interprofessionnel du Cognac only allowed its members to produce for a few months per year. Junior explained this to me as he drowned another 2 fingers of rum in coconut milk and ice for himself. He was about to say more, but a fit and 50 type with squash muscles and a Tommy Bahama shirt came over to trade backslaps and introduce the very, very young woman he was there with. I took advantage of the distraction to pluck a lowball glass off the bar and help myself to 2 fingers of dark, spicy rum. Katya, the very, very young woman, caught my eye as I ditched the pina colada glass on an end table and smiled. She was pretty and extremely well turned out. Blonde, Slavic, very thin, snowplow cheekbones, and a little black dress with a YSL clutch that looked real. Junior and Tommy Bahama were still trading stories of financial conquest. "It's my first time on Catalina," I said to Katya. "Oh," she said, a big, round, Eastern European vowel sound. "I come here many times. JK likes it." JK was Tommy Bahama. "It's so beautiful," she said. "So many beautiful animals." "I saw the bison today," I said. She had ice blue eyes and a page boy haircut that showed off her long neck and her diamond-studded earlobes. I got over any illusions about dating much younger women years ago, thankfully, but she gave off a vibe, parted lips, tilted head, sly eyes, that got me a little tongue-tied. They were so great, so big. She smiled, not quite a smirk. "Excuse me," she said, and headed for the bathroom. I stood on my own at the bar, nursing my neat rum. It was even better than I'd imagined, and feeling like a fool. JK was deep into a story about a zoning board fight in Palm Springs, where he also owned some very large hotels, and Junior was loving it. I was about to move off in search of Scott when Katya returned, touching me on the elbow. Her eyes were no longer sly. Her pupils were dilated so wide they almost swallowed her irises, and when she smiled, she bared her front teeth, as white and square and even as chiclets. "Sorry," she said. "Tell me more about buffaloes?" "Bison," I said. "Buffaloes are in Asia. Learned that today." I tapped my left nostril. "You missed a spot," I whispered. She bared her teeth even more and wiped away the white powder from her own left nostril, rubbed it on her gums, and then wiped her hand off on her dress. Looked down to make sure she hadn't left a streak, then back at me. "I have some to share, if you'd like," she said. "JK gets lots of it." I looked at JK and Scott, who were enumerating the many ways in which a certain Palm Springs city councilor was biddable. "You won't mind?" She tilted her head the other way. "That's not our way," she said. "Why not?" I let her lead me to the powder room. In the enclosed space, she smelled of expensive perfume, floral and fresh and outdoorsy. It was a good Catalina Island smell. As soon as she closed the door, I became uncomfortably, overpoweringly aware of her position relative to mine, the inches between her bare arm and mine, feeling electrically charged. I was not the kind of guy who found himself in the bathroom with beautiful, younger women who wanted to share their cocaine. "Let's do this," she said. Her accent gave the D a plosive pop, made the TH a softer D. She bared those perfect teeth again, then dug a little bottle out of her clutch and held it up so I could see that it was nearly full of white powder. JK gives good drugs. Drugs. Oh, I loved that accent. Have you two been together for very long? She gave me a searching look, like she was trying to figure out if I was pulling her leg. I see JK when he books me, she said. He likes variety, so only every month or so. But yes, for a year, I think. She watched me absorb that, and her smile got wider. You're a nice man, she said. She produced a small silver Coke spoon and held it so it caught the light. She mounted it high with Coke and held it up to my face. She took my chin with long, cool fingers and tilted my head, brought the spoon up to one nostril and pinched the other, her fingers resting on my lips. Cheers, she said, and I took a deep sniff. She stared into my eyes as the Coke came on. My skin felt all over tight. My pulse thudded in my throat where her thumb still had my jaw, and in my lips where her fingers rested. She looked at me this way and that, chin tilting, staring into my eyes like a jeweler assessing a gemstone. Finally, she gave the tiniest nod and withdrew her hand. My skin tingled where her fingertips had been. She held my gaze for another minute. My turn, she said, and scooped out her own mound. She sniffed it daintily, wrinkled her nose, closed her eyes, and turned her head to the ceiling, giving me a long look at her long neck, the vein in her throat, her collarbones, and the top of her cleavage. Then she shivered from top to toe and looked me back in the eyes. I don't think you're rich, Marty, she said. No, I said. Not like our host. Not like JK? No, I said. At first I thought you might be. You're not one of these people, and sometimes that means you're from a higher level. But you're just someone's friend, aren't you? I am, I said. I looked at her cocaine vial, now noticeably depleted. That was a business development asset, and she'd wasted it on me. I wanted to apologize, but I didn't want to offend her. She followed my gaze. It's okay, she said. I knew you weren't rich before I gave it to you. You seem interesting, not boring the way these rich ones are. It's nice to chat with someone who I'm not doing business with. There it was. I'd passed by an uncountable number of sex workers who were soliciting on the street, and objectively, I must have passed an equally uncountable number of sex workers who were just out shopping or going to the movies or the doctor's office or the daycare center. I'd even learned to recognize the telltale signs of a man's sex worker habit from his financials after a couple of divorce jobs where I got hired to audit the family books. Big cash withdrawals, obviously, but that could also be drugs. For sex workers, you also needed to look for regular charges from certain anything-goes payment processors, the kinds of places that host reviews or make arrangements. But I had never knowingly conversed with a sex worker up until that moment. I was worldly enough to suppose that questions about the job or how she got into it would not be welcome. Clearly, she was good at what she did. Not only was she carrying a $2,000 handbag and accompanying a very rich, if very dull, man, but she'd smoothly flirted with me in a way that had left me tongue-tied and disoriented. If I'd had the same kind of money as Tommy Bahama, JK, and she'd named a price, I'd have been very, very tempted. But I was just someone's friend. Thankfully. I've never been here before. What should I see? At the party? Nothing. The view, maybe. It's a good view. No, I mean on the island. She narrowed her eyes a little. I knew. Just making a joke. On the island, you should see the gardens. Very lovely. I go to them when JK is scuba diving. Boat tours are good. You can see the seals and the pelicans and sometimes a whale. But the best are the beaches on the other side of the island. 2 harbors. That's the place the inland road joins up with. We took a buffalo tour today. Bison, she said, a smile. 2 harbors is beautiful. 2 beaches like this. She put her hands side by side. This one, rough. This one, calm. Between them, a long rock like the tail of a whale. The local people go to them. Very hard to get to if you don't know a local. But you go. When JK is busy, I make friends. She shrugged. I like people. I almost cracked a joke about that being a good thing, considering her line of work, but I thought better of it. She must have seen what I was thinking because she smiled again. That way too, she said. But not just that way. The cocaine rush had settled down to a kind of hyper-alert state, thoughts chasing thoughts. One more, she said. A little bump? I should have said no, but I said yes, and she offered me the vial and the spoon this time, and I helped myself to a modest hillock. Sniff, sniff. Once again, she stared into my eyes as the rush hit. In the moment of drugged clarity, I realized that what I'd taken for sexual arousal was instead a clinical curiosity. She was trying to read something in me. Find out who I was. It was a smart business strategy, screen potential clients in these unguarded moments. Speaking as someone who'd had a few bad clients, including one that tried to kill me, I appreciated the tactic. No, not that time someone tried to kill me. No, not that time either. And no, not that time. How many times has someone tried to kill me? Jesus, what a question. Look, the first time someone tries to kill you, it makes an impression. The second time, too, and the third. By the 10th, it's just bad. Not memorable. Just bad. This isn't like those other stories, all right? Just let me tell it. You wanted to know why I was such an expert on prisons, and this is that story. Don't sulk. It's unbecoming. Look, I don't have to tell this story. We can just sit here and admire the Sierras and watch the stars. You're bored of stars. Really? These are really good stars, you know. Okay, I'll tell you. But try to appreciate the stars. Some people go their whole life without seeing this sky. What do you do, someone's friend? She asked as she put away the drugs and checked herself in the mirror. I'm a forensic accountant, I said. When I don't want to make an impression, I just say accountant. I guess I wanted to make an impression. I know accountant, but forensic? I find hidden money, I said. Like when one business partner is stealing from another or an ex-husband is hiding money from his ex-wife. She digested this. We could be a team, she said. I know a lot of ex-husbands. She had a good poker face. Only the quirk at the corner of one perfectly styled lip revealed the joke. Tell you what, if you ever meet an ex-wife you like, you can get in touch with me. I'm a little picky about who I work for, but I bet you've got good radar. I'm also picky, she said. The trick is to charge enough that you can afford to turn down the bad ones. That's my strategy too, I said. I charge 25% of whatever I recover. That means I only have to work a few months out of the year to cover my expenses. She giggled. We have the same business model, Marty. I only work a few nights every week. But tell me, how much choice do you really have in your clients? If you charge 25% and you only work a few months a year, then you must be chasing big dollars. And most people don't have big dollars. That's true, I said. There are some nice rich people, sure, but most of the people who need my services can't afford them. Like the guy at the In-N-Out whose paycheck is $28.68 light because the franchise owner is listing fake deductions. Not worth your time for $7.17, she said. You're good at math, I said. Moldova gold medal for math when I was 15, she said. Very good at math. Arithmetic, she said, dismissive. I miss set theory. That is math. I'll take your word for it. Accountants mostly just do arithmetic and a little stats, and most of that is just spreadsheet formulas I paste in. Very simple. Dismissive, again. What about your burger men, then? How do they get help? Sometimes I do a freebie, I said, when I hear about someone in need. She shook her head. I don't do freebies, she said. Everyone is in need. Then she giggled again. Come on, even Jack Keg is tired of hearing himself talk at last. She checked her nostrils in the mirror, patted my cheek, and led me out of the bathroom. If anyone noticed me leaving the bathroom with this beautiful, younger woman who was in JK's entourage, they didn't mention it. It was that kind of party. I found my way back to the bar, following Katya in my peripheral vision as she glided back to JK's side and insinuated herself in his conversational knot. Lionel Jr. was in a conversation with an older man with another younger woman, whose cheekbones and Slavic eyes rivaled Katya's. She gave me a cool look, and my incipient cocaine paranoia insisted that she had somehow gotten a subliminal tip from Katya, letting her know about my relative pauperhood. Lionel gave me a distracted half smile when I asked him if he minded my fixing myself a drink, and I got another lowball glass and 3 more fingers of that fantastic rum and drifted off. The sea breeze on the balcony smelled incredible and was just cool enough to take the edge off my buzz. Moonlight reflected on the sea, a rippling streak spilled along an endless, inky expanse. A few lights flickered among the yachts in the bay, and the sky was sprinkled with the stars that managed to outshine the lights from the other condos. I took it all in, breathing that salt air deep into my lungs. A bat or a nightbird rippled past, then another. Beautiful, isn't it? Scott had one of Junior's pina colada glasses with a pair of tall straws and a big pineapple slice for a garnish. It's amazing, I said. You're not enjoying the party, he said. It wasn't the question. It's fine, I said. It's not really my scene, but I'm not a snob. I'm sure that a lot of those people are interesting, fulfilled, thoughtful souls. I'm perfectly prepared to make small talk with as many as it takes to find some. He sipped his drink. You're a good guy, Marty. Yeah, some of these people are fine to chat with, but that's not why I like them. I like them because even though they're rich as hell, they take it easy. I work with so many millionaires who want to become decimillionaires, and every decimillionaire I've met dreams of being a centimillionaire, and they all want to be billionaires. Give any of them a 3-day weekend, and they'll spend it making a new pitch deck for the startup they're cooking up. These guys, they're not .com types. They want to be rich as hell, sure, and they all want to get richer, but they're doing it so they can do this. Go somewhere beautiful, get loaded, go sailing, or lie on a beach. I nodded. I can see that. That's how I operate, I guess. Do a few jobs, make a few months nut, then hit the road for a while, or just get a stack of library books and work my way through them at the local cafes, or even audit a course at Stanford, then take another job when my reserve fund bottoms out. Exactly. The difference is, I'm not the kind of guy whose idea of fun time is golfing or yachting or whatever these guys do. He looked up at the stars. Some of them aren't so bad, he said. And being out on boats can be a damned good time. It's not just parties like this. Parties like this? He turned and looked at me. Yeah, Marty. Parties like this. I know it's not your scene, but you'd be surprised at some of the connections you can make here. I nearly made one of those connections myself, I said. A very young woman from Moldova, very nice and smart as a whip, but she was looking for a professional kind of arrangement, and she's very far out of my league. Yeah, there's a lot of that here, too. But it's not like these guys invented it or anything. Sure, they call it the oldest profession for a reason. But don't you think there's something, you know, off about a 60-year-old rich guy out there shopping for 20-year-olds? Nothing against the relationships or the sex I had at 20, but one of the good things about adulthood is learning and growing. Those kids haven't had a chance yet. They may be smart as hell, but at 20, what have they got to be smart about? I hear you. I guess it's an island tradition. You know, Marilyn Monroe got married at 16 to a 21-year-old she'd met when she was just 15? They moved out here when she was 16 while he was in the Army. Back then, that was legal. No crime on Catalina Island, I said. Well, yeah, no crime anyone cares to prosecute. He stared at the stars again, moved closer, dropped his voice. I've been thinking of committing a crime, he said. A little salvo in the war on drugs. How do you feel about magic mushrooms? I had to laugh. Scott was definitely a mushrooms kind of guy. What was he doing at this powdery little event? I dropped my voice, too. How do they mix with cocaine? He shook his head. You have been making friends here, haven't you? In my experience, the two make for a pretty good combination. The shrooms take the edge off the coke, that's for sure. I don't know that I'd mix a lot of either. I've only partaken very modestly, I said. Then, speaking as your physician, I advise in favor of it.